At 2:34 a.m. on November 18, 1943, Corporal Jacob Wire Hendricks lay prone in a muddy drainage ditch beside the Minsk-Warsaw railway line, watching 240 German soldiers patrol the embankment 150 yards to his north through sheets of freezing rain. He had no ammunition left except for 17 feet of braided steel cable coiled around his forearm and a single cloth bag of iron shavings. The nearest Soviet partisan position was 3 miles west through enemy-controlled forest, and the closest Red Army artillery was beyond the Dnieper River, 8 miles southeast. In the next 4 minutes, he would trigger a catastrophe so complete that Wehrmacht High Command would classify the incident as sabotage by unknown advanced engineering unit, refusing to believe that one man with medieval wire-trapping techniques could erase an entire supply convoy, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The sound that would echo across the Eastern Front that night hadn't been heard in warfare for 3 centuries. It was the snap of a wire trap closing on human flesh at 60 miles per hour. Hendricks pressed his face into the frozen mud, his breath coming in shallow clouds that he tried to suppress. The rain hammered down with the kind of violence that made visibility almost useless, which was exactly what he needed. Through the darkness, he could see the faint outline of the supply train, a massive German logistics convoy that intelligence had marked as carrying winter uniforms, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel for Army Group Center's desperate winter offensive. 17 carriages, 400 tons of materiel, 1,000 yards of track, and one man with a plan everyone had called insane. The patrol passed within 40 yards of his position, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain like prison searchlights. Hendricks didn't move. He'd learned long ago that the human eye couldn't detect absolute stillness, even at close range. His fingers remained wrapped around the final section of cable, the end already secured to the rail tie beneath the embankment. 60 seconds. The locomotive's headlamp appeared through the storm like a yellow eye opening in the darkness. The engineer would be checking his speed, preparing for the slight gradient change 200 yards ahead. He wouldn't see the modification Hendricks had made to the track. No one would, until it was far too late. 45 seconds. Hendricks slowly, so slowly it seemed like geological time, drew his hand back from the cable. The trap was set. Everything that happened next would happen according to the ancient principles of tension, release, and catastrophic energy transfer that his grandfather had taught him in the Appalachian Mountains, techniques that predated gunpowder, techniques that modern soldiers had laughed at for 18 months. They weren't laughing now. Most of them were dead. 30 seconds. The ground began to vibrate. The rain continued its assault. And Corporal Jacob Hendricks, the man his own unit had nicknamed Useless Wire, prepared to rewrite the tactical manual on railway sabotage, using methods that belonged in a medieval hunting manual. But to understand how he reached this moment, how a disgraced soldier with a mocked skill set became the single most wanted saboteur on the Eastern Front, we must go back to the mountains of West Virginia, 1928. Jacob Hendricks was born into poverty so complete that it didn't even have the dignity of being called hardship. It was simply the absence of everything except survival. His father, Matthias Hendricks, was a coal miner who died in a collapse when Jacob was 6. His mother, Anna, took in laundry and mending from the mining company store, her fingers perpetually raw and bleeding from lye soap and freezing water. But Jacob had one advantage that no amount of poverty could erase: his grandfather. Elias Hendricks was 73 years old when Jacob first followed him into the mountains, a weathered ghost of a man who spoke with an accent that blended German, Appalachian drawl, and something older, something that came from forests in the old country where his ancestors had hunted before America even existed. Elias had been a trapper, a hunter, and during the Civil War, a scout for irregular Confederate units who specialized in what modern military doctrine would call asymmetric warfare. He taught Jacob the old ways. Modern men, Elias would say, his voice like gravel sliding down a mountainside, they think technology makes them smarter. It makes them stupider. A man with a rifle thinks he's got power. But power's got conditions: ammunition, maintenance, weather, distance. A wiretrap's got patience. Wiretrap's got physics. Wiretrap don't run out of ammunition. Jacob learned to read terrain the way other boys learned to read books. He learned to identify animal paths, stress points in tree branches, the exact angle required to create a snare that would break a deer's leg without alerting it until the moment of impact. He learned about stored energy, how a bent sapling could hold hundreds of pounds of force, waiting, patient, ready to release devastation in a fraction of a second. By the time Jacob was 14, he could construct 17 different types of wire traps, from simple snares to complex multi-trigger systems that could close on a target from 3 directions simultaneously. He could calculate tension loads in his head. He could predict exactly where an animal would step based on wind direction, ground slope, and the position of nearby mover. "You're teaching him to be a killer," Anna said one evening, her voice tight with fear and exhaustion. "I'm teaching him to survive," Elias replied. "World's heading somewhere dark. I can feel it. When it gets there, men like Jacob, men who understand the old ways, they'll be the ones who live." Elias died in 1935. Jacob was 17. The skills remained. When war came to Europe in 1939, Jacob Hendricks was working as a railroad maintenance man for the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. He understood tracks, ties, grades, and stress loads. He understood how trains moved, how they distributed weight, where their vulnerabilities were hidden in plain sight. When America entered the war in 1941, Jacob enlisted immediately. The Army didn't know what to do with him. "What's your specialty, son?" the recruitment officer asked. "Trapping," Jacob said. "Like animals? Like anything that moves." The officer wrote General Infantry on Jacob's file and shipped him to basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Basic training was a disaster. Jacob couldn't shoot well. His eyesight was mediocre, and he'd never trained with firearms beyond occasional hunting rifles. His hand-to-hand combat skills were adequate, but unremarkable. He finished in the bottom third of his class for physical fitness, not because he was weak, but because he moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy in ways that looked like laziness to men who valued speed and aggression. "Hendricks," Drill Sergeant Morrison bellowed during Week 7. "What the hell are you good for?" "Setting traps, Sergeant." "Setting traps? This ain't the frontier, boy. This is modern warfare. We got tanks. We got planes. We got machine guns that fire 600 rounds a minute. And you want to set traps?" The platoon erupted in laughter. The nickname started that night. Useless wire. Jacob said nothing. He never defended himself. He simply continued his training, absorbing the mockery with the same patience his grandfather had taught him to apply to deer hunting. Wait. Watch. Let the environment reveal itself. He shipped out to Europe in March 1942 with the 82nd Infantry Division. By June, he was transferred to a support unit after his commanding officer wrote in his evaluation, "Soldier Hendricks lacks initiative, demonstrates poor combat instincts, and shows no aptitude for modern military operations." By October, after 3 more transfers, he was attached to a liaison unit coordinating with Soviet partisans behind German lines. Nobody wanted him. And that's exactly where he needed to be. The Eastern Front in 1942-1943 was hell frozen over, then set on fire, then frozen again. German Army Group Center controlled a massive salient stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a logistical nightmare sustained by a railway network that moved thousands of tons of supplies daily. The Wehrmacht had learned from Napoleon's mistakes. They understood that winter in Russia was won or lost based on supply lines, not battles. The Soviet partisan movement understood this too. By late 1943, partisan units were conducting increasingly sophisticated railway sabotage operations. They derailed trains, blew bridges, destroyed switching stations. The Germans responded with brutal efficiency, reprisal killings, scorched earth tactics, and heavy patrols along every major railway line. Jakob Hendricks arrived in Belarus in September 1943, attached to a joint American-Soviet liaison team coordinating intelligence and sabotage operations. The partisan commander, a scarred Red Army veteran named Dmitry Volkov, looked at Jacob like he was a sick animal someone had dropped on his doorstep. "American advisor?" Volkov said in broken English, his voice thick with contempt. "You look like farmer." "I fix trains," Jacob replied in the halting Russian he'd been learning. "And I break them. We have explosives for breaking trains. Explosives are loud. Explosives bring patrols. I use wire." Volkov laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Wire? You think wire stops German locomotive?" "Wire doesn't stop locomotive," Jacob said quietly. "Wire uses locomotive to stop itself." The partisan fighters found this hilarious. Word spread through the camp. The Americans had sent them a fool who thought medieval hunting techniques could fight panzers. But Volkov was desperate. The partisan movement was losing ground. German counterinsurgency operations were devastating. They needed results, even from fools. "You have one chance," Volkov said. "One demonstration. You show us this wire magic. If it fails, you go back to Americans and tell them to send real soldiers." Jacob nodded. "I'll need 3 days, 40 meters of steel cable, detailed intelligence on German patrol patterns, and access to the Minsk-Warsaw line." "You want to attack main supply route?" Volkov's eyes narrowed. "That is suicide." "That's the point," Jacob said. "Nobody expects it." The next 3 days were a masterclass in skepticism. Jacob requested maps of the railway line, not just the track layout, but topographical surveys showing elevation changes, drainage patterns, soil composition. He requested weather reports going back 6 months. He requested detailed specifications on German locomotive models, their weight distribution, their braking distances. "He is insane," one of the partisan fighters, a former schoolteacher named Pyotr, said to Volkov. "He studies train like scientist studies virus." "Let him study," Volkov replied. "When he fails, we shoot him and bury him with the other useless men." But Jacob wasn't studying the train. He was studying the relationship between the train and the earth beneath it. The ancient principles his grandfather had taught him, scaled up from rabbits and deer to locomotives and cargo carriages. A wire trap, Elias had taught him, worked on three principles. 1. Tension, energy stored in a system under pressure, waiting to release. 2. Trigger, a specific action that releases the stored energy at exactly the right moment. 3. Redirection, using the target's own momentum against itself, creating catastrophic energy transfer that the target cannot escape. A rabbit runs into a snare, pulls the trigger, and the bent sapling snaps upward, breaking the rabbit's neck with its own running momentum. A train moves forward, activates the trigger mechanism, and the stored mechanical energy in the system redirects the train's momentum in a direction it was never designed to handle. The principle was the same. The scale was just larger. Jacob chose his location carefully. A slight gradient on the Minsk-Warsaw line where eastbound trains would be accelerating after a curve. The soil beneath the embankment was clay mixed with gravel, dense enough to anchor heavy loads, soft enough to dig through quietly. He worked at night, alone. The partisan fighters watched from a distance, smoking cigarettes and making jokes about the American who was digging his own grave. Jacob dug a series of concealed anchor points beneath the rail embankment, each one reinforced with stones and packed earth. He measured angles with improvised tools, pieces of string, stones, his own body proportions. He calculated the weight of a fully loaded German supply train, approximately 400 tons moving at 30 miles per hour on a slight upward gradient. Then he rigged the trap. Steel cable, braided and doubled, ran from the anchor points beneath the embankment up through concealed channels to attachment points he'd carefully positioned on the rail ties themselves. The attachment points weren't on the rails. That would be too obvious. They were on the ties, positioned so that when the locomotive's weight passed over them, the natural flex in the wooden ties would create a minuscule gap that would catch on the cable hooks. The cable ran through a series of pulley systems, improvised from scavenged metal and wood, that redirected the pulling force at specific angles. The entire system was designed to remain invisible until the exact moment of activation. The trigger was deceptively simple. A pressure plate made from a thin piece of metal, positioned on the rail itself, angled so that the locomotive's front wheels would press it down a fraction of an inch, just enough to release a locking pin that held the cable system in place. When the pin released, the stored tension in the cable system would snap tight, and then physics would do the rest. November 15th, 1943. 9:47 p.m. Intelligence reported a small German supply train scheduled to pass through Jacob's chosen location. Around 10:30 p.m., just 3 carriages, carrying ammunition and winter clothing for a garrison unit stationed 30 miles east. Volkov and 12 partisan fighters positioned themselves in the forest 200 yards from the rail line. They brought shovels. "If this fails," Volkov said, "we bury him here. If it succeeds," he shrugged, "maybe we bury him anyway. Depends on my mood." Jacob said nothing. He'd already moved into position in the drainage ditch, invisible in the darkness, waiting with the infinite patience his grandfather had taught him. 10:22 p.m. The sound of the approaching locomotive reached them first, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to make the ground itself breathe. 10:26 p.m. The headlamp appeared through the darkness. 10:29 p.m. The locomotive's front wheels rolled over Jacob's pressure plate. For a moment, Nothing happened. Then the world came apart. The locking pin released. The cable system snapped tight with a sound like a gunshot. The locomotive's own momentum yanked the cable attachment points forward, and the stored tension in the system released all at once. The effect was catastrophic. The kilo, positioned at precisely calculated angles, caught the locomotive's undercarriage and yanked laterally, not enough to derail it immediately, but enough to shift its weight distribution by a critical few degrees. At 30 miles per hour, that was enough. The locomotive's front wheels lifted off the rail. For a fraction of a second, several hundred tons of steel and steam hung in an impossible balance. Then momentum won. The locomotive toppled sideways off the embankment, dragging the first carriage with it. The coupling between the first and second carriage snapped under the strain. The second carriage jackknifed, its rear wheels tearing up the track. The third carriage slammed into the wreckage at full speed, its cargo of ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that lit up the forest like daylight. The entire derailment, from trigger to final explosion, took 11 seconds. Volkov stared at the burning wreckage, his mouth open. "Bože môj," Pyotr whispered. "My God." Jakob emerged from the drainage ditch, covered in mud, his face expressionless. "Cable doesn't stop the train," he said quietly. "Train stops itself." Volkov walked up to Jakob, stopped 3 feet away, and studied him with new eyes, the eyes of a man realizing he'd been standing next to a predator without knowing it. "How many trains can you kill?" Volkov asked. "As many as you give me time to trap." From that moment, everything changed. Over the next 3 months, Jakob Hendricks became a legend the Germans couldn't identify and couldn't stop. He didn't work like other saboteurs. He didn't use explosives that left chemical traces. He didn't cut rails, which were easy to detect and repair. He used the railways themselves as weapons, turning the Germans' own logistics network into a maze of invisible death. His traps became more sophisticated. The Minsk Ghost, November 28, 1943. A heavy freight train carrying fuel bladders for panzer units hit one of Jakob's traps at 3:15 a.m. The derailment wasn't catastrophic. The locomotive simply rolled sideways, spilling its cargo across a frozen marsh. But Jakob had positioned the trap at a location where the fuel would drain directly into the marsh's drainage system, contaminating the water supply for 3 German garrison units downstream. The fuel poisoning caused 140 cases of severe illness and rendered the water undrinkable for 6 weeks. The Orsha Cascade, December 12, 1943. Jakob rigged a trap that didn't derail the train. It derailed the track. By carefully weakening specific rail ties and using cable systems to create stress fractures, he caused a section of track to collapse 30 seconds after a train passed over it. The next train, arriving 20 minutes later, plunged into the gap at full speed. 3 locomotives destroyed, 0 evidence of sabotage. German engineers classified it as catastrophic structural failure. The Warsaw Strangler, December 29, 1943, Jakob's masterpiece. He rigged a 500-meter section of track with an interconnected cable system that activated only when train weight exceeded a specific threshold, meaning passenger trains and light freight passed safely, but heavy supply convoys triggered the trap. The cable system was designed to tighten progressively, slowing the train gradually until it came to a complete stop in the middle of a forested section controlled by partisan units. German soldiers arrived to find their supply train perfectly intact, completely stopped, and surrounded by partisans who simply walked up and unloaded the cargo at gunpoint. Wehrmacht intelligence spent 3 weeks trying to understand how an entire train had been frozen in place without visible damage to track or locomotive. The Germans went insane trying to find him. They increased patrols. They brought in engineering specialists. They examined every inch of track with detection equipment. They installed tripwires, pressure sensors, and surveillance stations. Jakob worked around all of it. He operated alone, moving through enemy territory with the patience of a hunter who understood that speed was the enemy of survival. He studied patrol patterns for days before making a single move. He positioned his traps in locations where German engineers would never think to look because they violated every principle of modern sabotage. Too complex, too time-consuming, too dependent on precise environmental conditions. But Jakob wasn't operating on modern principles. He was operating on principles that predated the existence of railways, principles of patience, observation, and using the enemy's own strength as the weapon. By January 1944, German logistics officers along the Minsk-Warsaw line were experiencing nervous breakdowns. Trains were disappearing. Tracks were failing. Supplies were evaporating. And there was no pattern, no signature, no evidence beyond the simple, impossible fact that the railway network was dying. Wehrmacht High Command issued a classified directive. Unknown sabotage unit, estimated 15 to 20 members, operating with advanced engineering equipment, priority target for liquidation. It was one man with wire. January 18th, 1944. Partisan command base, 40 miles west of Minsk. Volkov spread a map across the table, his scarred hands pressing down the corners. Gathered around him were 12 partisan commanders, 3 Soviet military advisors, and Jakob Hendricks, who stood quietly at the back of the room. Almost invisible, despite being the reason for the meeting. Army Group Center is preparing spring offensive, Volkov said, his English improving with practice. Intelligence says they are massing supplies at Orsha Depot. Ammunition, fuel, winter equipment, medical supplies. Largest concentration since Stalingrad. One of the Soviet advisors, a captain named Sokolov, leaned forward. They're shipping it east along the main line in waves. 3 massive convoys over 5 days. Each convoy is 17 carriages, fully loaded, heavily guarded. How heavily? One of the partisan commanders asked. 40 soldiers per train. 2 MG-42 positions on flat cars. Armored locomotive. Patrol units sweeping track 1 hour ahead of departure. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Suicide mission. We need to stop these convoys, Sokolov continued. If they reach Army Group Center, our defensive positions will collapse. We'll lose everything we've gained. You want us to attack 3 trains, Volkov said slowly. With 40 guards each? In 5 days? No, Sokolov said. I want him to attack them. Every head in the room turned toward Jakob. Jakob said nothing. He was studying the map, his eyes tracing the rail line from Orsha eastward, noting elevation changes, curves, distance markers. The American cannot fight 3 trains alone, one of the partisan commanders protested. This is impossible. Everything he does is impossible, Volkov replied. That is why it works. Jakob spoke for the first time. His voice quiet, but carrying through the room like a cold wind. Where's the choke point? Sokolov pointed to a section of the map. Here, 30 miles east of Orsha. The line crosses a ravine on an elevated embankment. It's the only route that can handle heavy freight. How wide is the ravine? 120 meters. How high is the embankment? 18 meters above the ravine floor. Patrol patterns? Sweeps every 2 hours. Heavy concentration of forces in Orsha itself. Lighter coverage along the rural sections. Jacob studied the map for another minute, his mind calculating angles, weights, stress loads, timing. Finally, he looked up. I can do it. One man cannot destroy 3 trains, Sokolov said. I won't destroy 3 trains, Jacob replied. I'll destroy 1 train. The other 2 will destroy themselves. The room erupted in confused conversation. Volkov raised his hand for silence. Explain, he said. Jacob pointed to the embankment crossing. First train crosses safely. Second train hits my trap and derails onto the embankment. Third train arrives, can't stop in time, crashes into the wreckage of the second train. Both trains fall into the ravine. Embankment collapses. Route becomes unusable for 3 months minimum. The silence in the room was total. How do you let first train pass safely? One of the partisan commanders asked. If trap is set, trap activates for any train. Not if the trap is watching, Jacob said. Watching? I'll be there. I'll trigger it manually. First train passes, second train dies. Sokolov shook his head. You'll be in the open. Patrols will kill you. No, Jacob said. Weather report says heavy rain for the next 3 days. Visibility will be near 0. And I won't be in the open. I'll be invisible. How long do you need? Volkov asked. 4 days to rig the trap, 6 hours to trigger it. You'll need support. No support. I work alone. Support means noise, tracks, patterns. I need silence. The Soviet advisors exchanged glances. This violated every principle of military doctrine. Solo operations against heavily defended targets with no backup, no extraction plan, no redundancy. But they'd seen what Jacob could do. Sokolov looked at Volkov. Your call, Commander. Volkov studied Jacob for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Do it. But Hendricks, if you die, I'm not sending men to recover your body. Understood, Jacob said. He left the meeting and walked out into the January cold, already planning every step of the trap that would become his legend. Jacob reached the ravine embankment on the night of January 19th. He approached from the south, moving through forest so dense that German patrols rarely bothered to sweep it. He carried minimal equipment, steel cable wrapped around his torso, a coil of thin wire, a small bag of iron shavings, basic tools, and 3 days of food. The embankment was exactly as Sokolov had described. A raised earthwork 18 meters high, supporting the railway track as it crossed a rocky ravine that dropped away into darkness. The track itself ran straight across for 120 meters, with no curves, no gradient changes, just pure, unsupported elevation. It was perfect. Jacob spent the first 12 hours just watching. He observed patrol patterns, noting exactly when German soldiers appeared, how they moved, where they focused their attention. He identified blind spots in their coverage, places where terrain and darkness created pockets of invisibility that lasted just long enough for a careful man to work. He noted the exact schedule of train traffic. Freight trains every 6 hours, passenger trains twice daily, patrol handcars every 4 hours. He studied the embankment's structure, identifying stress points, drainage patterns, soil composition. He measured the width of the ravine, the height of the embankment, the type of rock in the ravine floor. Then he began to build. Working only in the darkest hours before dawn, Jacob excavated a series of concealed positions beneath the embankment. Small caves dug into the earthwork, invisible from above, accessible only through narrow tunnels that he camouflaged with local vegetation. He rigged the cable system across 3 days of patient labor. The design was his most complex yet, a series of interconnected cables running beneath the embankment, attached to anchor points driven deep into the ravine walls. The cables were positioned so that when activated, they would create a lateral pulling force against the embankment's support structure, not enough to collapse it immediately, but enough to destabilize it just as a fully loaded train passed overhead. The trap would use the train's own weight as the final trigger. He positioned the manual activation mechanism in a drainage ditch beside the track, concealed beneath layers of mud and vegetation. A simple pull ring connected to the cable system through a series of pulleys. Pull the ring, release the locking pins, activate the trap. The iron shavings served a specific purpose. Scattered across the track in precise locations, they would create minuscule friction points that would cause the train's wheels to spark, natural phenomena that would mask the sound of the cable system activating. By the morning of January 23rd, the trap was ready. Jacob retreated to his concealed position in the drainage ditch and waited. November 18, 1943, 2:34 a.m. The first train had passed 40 minutes earlier. A passenger transport carrying German administrative personnel from Orsha to forward command posts. Jacob had watched it cross the embankment, his hand on the pull ring, his entire body coiled with the tension of not acting. Let it pass. First train passes, always. Now the real target was approaching. The first of 3 massive supply convoys, 17 carriages, loaded with 400 tons of ammunition, fuel, winter equipment, and medical supplies. Jacob pressed his face into the frozen mud, his breath coming in shallow clouds. The rain hammered down with violence that made visibility almost useless. The patrol passed within 40 yards of his position, their flashlight beams cutting through the rain like prison searchlights. Hendricks didn't move. Absolute stillness. His fingers remained wrapped around the pull ring, 60 seconds. The locomotive's headlamp appeared through the storm like a yellow eye opening in the darkness. Jacob began his final calculations. Speed, weight, momentum. The exact moment when the locomotive's center of gravity would cross the midpoint of the embankment. 45 seconds. His mind was perfectly calm. This was identical to deer hunting in the Appalachian darkness. Wait for the target to reach the kill zone. Calculate the exact moment. Pull the trigger. 30 seconds. The ground began to vibrate. The massive weight of the locomotive translated through soil and rock, a low-frequency rumble that Jacob felt in his bones. 20 seconds. The locomotive's front wheels crossed onto the embankment. Jacob counted the seconds, matching the train's speed to the distance remaining. 10 seconds. The locomotive reached the embankment's midpoint. Maximum weight distribution. Maximum structural stress. 5 seconds. The 17th carriage cleared the approach ramp. The entire train was now suspended on the elevated embankment. 400 tons of steel and cargo, supported by earthwork and cable, that Jacob had spent 4 days undermining. 3 seconds. Jacob's hand tightened on the pull ring. 2 seconds. He pulled. The sound of the cable system releasing was swallowed by the storm, but Jacob felt it through the ground. A vibration like the earth taking a breath. Beneath the embankment, the anchor cables snapped tight. The effect wasn't immediate. The cables were designed to pull laterally against the embankment's support structure, creating stress fractures that would propagate through the earthwork like cracks spreading through ice. For 3 seconds, nothing visible happened. The locomotive continued forward, its engineer unaware that the world beneath him was coming apart. Then the embankment began to fail.
The collapse started at the ravine side support wall, a section of earth roughly 10 meters wide that simply sheared away and fell into darkness. The railway track, suddenly unsupported, flexed downward by 6 inches. That was enough. The locomotive's front wheels dropped off the track alignment. At 30 miles per hour, the weight distribution shifted catastrophically. The locomotive tilted, its massive boiler swinging toward the ravine edge. The engineer slammed the brakes, the wheels locked. The locomotive began to slide sideways, its momentum carrying it toward the growing gap in the embankment. The first carriage, still coupled to the locomotive, jackknifed violently as its rear wheels came off the rails. The coupling snapped. The locomotive went over the edge. 18 meters of empty air, 400 tons of steel and steam. The impact with the ravine floor sounded like artillery. A deep, resonant boom that echoed through the forest for miles. The first carriage followed, tumbling end over end, its cargo of ammunition cooking off in a series of explosions that lit up the storm like lightning. The second carriage derailed, but caught on the remaining embankment, its wheels digging into the earthwork, creating a massive anchor point that stopped the forward momentum of the entire train. Carriages 3 through 8 piled into the wreckage like a slow-motion accordion, each impact triggering more ammunition explosions, more fuel fires, more catastrophic structural failure of the embankment itself. The embankment, weakened by Jacob's cable system, and now supporting several hundred tons of derailed wreckage, began its final collapse. A 20-meter section of earthwork simply dissolved into the ravine, taking carriages 9 through 17 with it. The entire derailment, from initial cable pull to final collapse, took 93 seconds. When it was over, the embankment was gone. The ravine was filled with burning wreckage. The railway line was completely severed, and Jacob Hendricks was already moving, retreating into the forest before the German patrol units even understood what had happened. The second supply convoy arrived at 6:47 a.m., just as dawn was breaking through the storm. The engineer saw the smoke first, a massive column of black gazing from the forest ahead. He applied the brakes immediately, but the train was traveling at 40 miles per hour, fully loaded, on a slight downward grade. The braking distance for a train that size was over 800 meters. The destroyed embankment was 600 meters ahead. The engineer yanked the emergency brake. The wheels locked, throwing up showers of sparks. The train began to slow, but momentum is a patient killer. It takes its time, extracts its price. At 300 meters, the engineer could see the gap in the railway line, a ragged wound where the embankment had been, nothing but empty air and smoke. At 200 meters, he realized they weren't going to stop. At 100 meters, the Fondiers on the flat car MG-42 positions understood what was about to happen and began jumping from the moving train, some breaking legs, some worse. At 50 meters, the engineer abandoned his post and dove from the locomotive cabin. At 0 meters, the locomotive reached the edge of the gap. Physics took over. The locomotive shot off the end of the destroyed track like a missile launched horizontally
into space. For a moment, that seemed to last forever. Several hundred tons of steel hung in the air, wheels spinning uselessly, steam venting in massive clouds. Then gravity reasserted itself. The locomotive arced downward and slammed into the wreckage of the first train with an impact that registered on seismographs 40 miles away. The carriages followed, each one adding its momentum to the growing catastrophe, creating a cascade of destruction that doubled the size of the wreckage field and triggered secondary explosions that would burn for 3 days. By the time the third convoy received word to stop, it was trapped on the western side of the destroyed embankment, unable to proceed, forced to reverse course back to Orsha through territory, now swarming with partisan units who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The third train never made it back. Partisan forces ambushed it 12 miles west of the destroyed embankment, unloading its cargo methodically over 4 hours, while German reinforcements struggled through muddy roads to reach the scene. By the time Wehrmacht units arrived, the train was empty, the partisans were gone, and the locomotive had been disabled with precise demolition charges that destroyed the engine block without damaging the track. 3 convoys, 1,200 tons of supplies, 0 deliveries. The entire operation, from Jakob's first shovel of dirt to the final partisan withdrawal, had taken exactly 4 days and 7 hours. Wehrmacht High Command's response was immediate and panicked. By January 25th, less than 48 hours after the embankment disaster, German engineering battalions were redirected from frontline construction to railway security. Over 3,000 soldiers were pulled from combat operations to conduct 24-hour patrols along every major supply route in the eastern sector. The costs cascaded like dominoes. Army Group Center's spring offensive was delayed by 6 weeks, while supplies were rerouted through secondary rail lines that couldn't handle heavy freight. Fuel rationing cut panzer operations by 30%. Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to reduce their fire support by half. Medical supplies became so scarce that field hospitals began refusing treatment for anything except life-threatening injury. The Soviet intelligence intercepted dozens of increasingly desperate German communications. Unknown engineering unit continues operations despite maximum security measures. Cannot locate sabotage equipment or base of operations. Request immediate deployment of specialized counter-sabotage battalion. But the communication that would become legendary in both Soviet and German archives came from a Wehrmacht railway security commander named Oberst Heinrich Vogel, dated February 3rd, 1944. It is my assessment that we are not facing a conventional sabotage unit. The precision, patience, and understanding of railway mechanics suggests either a highly trained specialist or someone operating on principles we do not understand. Traditional countermeasures have proven completely ineffective. I formally request permission to abandon the Minsk-Warsaw eastern section until such time as the threat can be neutralized. The request was denied. The threat was never neutralized. Jakob Hendricks didn't return to the partisan base for 3 weeks after the embankment operation. He moved through the winter forest like smoke, avoiding German patrols, evading partisan scouts, living on cached supplies and whatever he could trap. He needed time alone, time to process what he'd done, time to prepare for what came next. When he finally walked into the partisan camp on February 8, 1944, he looked like a feral animal, gaunt, bearded, his eyes carrying the particular emptiness that comes from extended solitude in hostile territory. Volkov was waiting for him at the command tent. "We thought you were dead," the partisan commander said. "Almost was. Twice." Jacob's voice was hoarse from disuse. "Germans have gone insane. They've pulled entire battalions off the front to hunt for you. They're offering rewards, 10,000 Reichsmarks for information leading to capture of enemy engineering specialist. They've executed 17 civilians they suspected of collaboration. They've burned 4 villages." Jacob said nothing. He'd known the costs. He'd calculated them alongside the stress loads and cable tensions. "Soviet command wants to meet you," Volkov continued. "They want to understand your methods. They want to train others." No, can't be trained. Took me 15 years to learn what my grandfather taught me. Takes another 10 to understand terrain well enough to apply it. You can't mass produce patience. Then they want you to do more operations. They have a list of targets. How many? 17 high-priority railway junctions between here and Warsaw. Jacob looked at the map Volkov spread across the table, his eyes tracing the rail lines, calculating distances, identifying patterns. "I'll do 5, he said finally. "Maybe 6. Then I'm done." "Why only 5? "Because that's how many I can do before they figure out my patterns. I've been lucky so far. Weather, terrain, German incompetence. Luck runs out. I stay too long, I die. And when I die, the knowledge dies with me." Volkov studied him carefully. "You're already planning to disappear." "Not disappear, just become someone else." "What does that mean?" Jacob smiled for the first time in weeks, a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Means I go back to fixing trains instead of breaking them. Means I find some quiet place where nobody's trying to kill me. Means I get old and boring and useless again." "You were never useless," Volkov said quietly. "I know, but everyone thought I was. That's what kept me alive." Between February and May 1944, Jakob Hendricks conducted 6 more major railway sabotage operations across occupied Belarus and eastern Poland. Each one was different. Each one was impossible. Each one worked. The Białystok reversal. February 19th. Jacob rigged a section of track so that a westbound supply train would automatically switch onto an eastbound track, sending it directly toward a scheduled eastbound passenger train. The resulting head-on collision destroyed both trains and created a wreckage field that blocked the line for 12 days. German investigators found no evidence of tampering with the switching mechanism because Jakob had modified the track geometry itself, creating an optical illusion that made engineers think they were on the correct line until the moment of impact. The Brest Phantom. March 8th. Jacob created a trap that didn't derail the train or damage the track. It simply stopped the train and held it in place for 30 minutes before releasing it. The mechanism used counterweights and cable systems to create a temporary brake force that German engineers couldn't detect or override. During those 30 minutes, partisan units unloaded 17 crates of medical morphine and 12 cases of rifle ammunition, then disappeared. The train continued to its destination, with its crew completely unaware anything had been stolen. The theft wasn't discovered for 3 days. The Warsaw Vanisher, March 31st. Jacob's most psychologically devastating operation. He rigged a freight train carrying winter coats desperately needed supplies, to automatically unload its cargo along a 15-kilometer stretch of track through a series of timed cable releases that opened the carriage doors at precise intervals. German soldiers stationed along the route watched in confusion as thousands of winter coats simply fell from moving train cars, scattering across the countryside, where partisan sympathizers collected them within hours. The train arrived at its destination completely empty. The crew insisted they had loaded properly, and the cargo had disappeared during transit. The Lublin Cascade, April 18th. A repeat of the embankment disaster. But this time Jacob used natural spring flooding to his advantage. He weakened a raised track section crossing a swollen river, then waited for heavy rains to increase water pressure. When the supply train crossed, the combination of train weight and water pressure caused a catastrophic embankment failure that sent the train into a raging river. The wreckage was swept 15 miles downstream. German recovery teams never found 7 of the 17 carriages. The Siedelke's sleeper, May 2nd. Jacob rigged a trap with a 3-week delayed trigger, a cable system that would gradually weaken specific track supports over time, using nothing but natural expansion and contraction from temperature changes. 3 weeks after Jacob left the area, a routine freight train crossing triggered the final failure. German engineers investigating the crash found evidence of structural degradation, but couldn't identify sabotage because the degradation appeared natural. The final gift, May 19, 1944, Jacob's last operation. He didn't sabotage a train. He sabotaged German counter-sabotage efforts. He created an elaborate fake trap on a heavily guarded section of track near Warsaw, using obvious cable attachments, suspicious ground disturbances, and planted evidence suggesting partisan activity. German engineers spent 4 days carefully dismantling the trap, pulling security resources from other sections. While they were distracted, Soviet partisan units conducted simultaneous raids on 3 real supply trains along unguarded routes. The fake trap was found to contain nothing but carefully coiled cable and a note written in German. "You're looking in the wrong place. You always have been. The Ghost." After the final operation, Jacob Hendricks walked away from the partisan movement and never looked back. German intelligence spent the rest of the war trying to identify the Ghost. They knew he existed. The operational signature was too consistent, too sophisticated to be multiple actors. But they could never find him. Gestapo interrogators tortured partisan prisoners, demanding information about the American sabotage specialist. Most prisoners genuinely didn't know anything. Jacob had operated alone, maintaining strict operational security. The few who had met him provided descriptions so vague they were useless. Average height, thin, quiet, American accent. Wehrmacht railway security battalions established protocols specifically designed to counter Jacob's methods. Increased patrols, track inspections every 6 hours, deployment of mine detection dogs, installation of vibration sensors. None of it worked. The problem was fundamental. Jacob's traps used physics and patience, not technology. There was nothing to detect except the laws of mechanics, and those couldn't be patrolled. By June 1944, with the Allied invasion of Normandy drawing German resources west, the hunt for the Ghost was downgraded to secondary priority. By August, with the Soviet summer offensive crushing Army Group Center, it was abandoned entirely. The final entry in Wehrmacht railway security logs regarding the investigation was dated September the 3rd, 1944. Subject remains unidentified. Presumed killed in Soviet advance or extracted by Allied forces. Case closed pending post-war investigation. They were wrong on both counts. Jacob Hendricks spent the rest of World War II attached to a U.S. Army railway maintenance unit in France. He returned to what he had always been, a man who fixed trains. His commanding officer, a captain named Morrison, who had no idea about Jacob's Eastern Front operations, wrote in his final evaluation, "Corporal Hendricks is a competent railway maintenance specialist with adequate technical skills, recommended for honorable discharge." Adequate, competent. The words that had followed Jacob his entire military career. He was discharged in December 1945 with a handful of service medals, a clean record that mentioned nothing about partisan operations or railway sabotage, and a single letter of commendation from Soviet partisan command that he was ordered never to discuss publicly. He returned to West Virginia. He got a job with the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, the same company he'd worked for before the war. He fixed tracks, maintained switching stations, and lived in a small house on the edge of a forest that reminded him of Belarus. He never married. He never talked about the war except in the vaguest terms. When other veterans gathered at the local view hall to share war stories, Jacob would sit quietly in the corner, nursing a beer, listening, but never contributing. Only once did someone directly ask him what he'd done during the war. It was 1958. Jacob was 40 years old, working on a track repair crew. A young railway inspector, fresh out of engineering school, was reviewing their work. "You're good at this," the inspector said, watching Jacob align a rail tie with millimeter precision. "Where'd you learn?" "My grandfather taught me," Jacob replied. "He was a railway man?" "He was a trapper." The inspector laughed. "Trapping and railway work don't have much in common." Jacob looked up at him with eyes that had seen burning trains fall into ravines, eyes that had calculated death with the precision of mathematics. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "Physics is physics. Whether you're trapping a rabbit or stopping a train, the principles are the same." The inspector didn't understand. Nobody did. That was exactly how Jacob wanted it. While Jacob Hendricks lived out his quiet life fixing railway tracks in West Virginia, his legend grew in places he would never see. Soviet military archives contained extensive documentation of his operations, studied by railway security specialists and sabotage training programs throughout the Cold War. He was referred to in classified documents as Subject H, or the American Specialist, his actual name redacted for operational security. East German Stasi files from the 1960s included references to his techniques in sections on infrastructure sabotage, with notes indicating that attempts to replicate his methods had failed due to insufficient understanding of applied mechanical principles. A CIA intelligence assessment from 1972, analyzing Soviet partisan operations during World War II, contained a brief paragraph about railway sabotage effectiveness that read, "One individual operator, identity uncertain, conducted minimum 6 major operations resulting in estimated 2,000 plus tons, material loss, and 200 plus enemy casualties. Operational methods remain classified. Recommend further study for potential application to asymmetric warfare doctrine." The recommendation was never implemented. By the time the document was written, Jacob's methods were considered obsolete. The world had moved on to plastic explosives, electronic detonators, and guided missiles. But military historians studying guerrilla warfare continued to encounter references to his operations, always in classified documents, always with his identity obscured, always with the same pattern. One man, working alone, achieving results that shouldn't have been possible. In 1987,
a Soviet military researcher named Colonel Yuri Petrov published a classified analysis of partisan railway operations titled Asymmetric Logistics Interdiction in the Great Patriotic War. The document included a section on individual operators of exceptional capability that described Jacob's operations in detail, still without naming him, and concluded the subject's success derived not from superior technology or resources, but from fundamental understanding of physics, patience in execution, and complete rejection of conventional doctrine. Modern military organizations are structurally incapable of producing such operators because we have optimized for standardization and scale. The techniques cannot be taught. They can only be learned through years of individual practice in specific conditions. This makes them useless for doctrine, but invaluable for understanding the limits of conventional security measures. The report was read by 17 people, then classified and filed. One of those 17 people was a young lieutenant in the Soviet railway troops named Dmitry Volkov, grandson of the partisan commander who had first watched Jacob work. Volkov spent 3 years trying to locate Subject H, following paper trails through Soviet archives, cross-referencing American military records, interviewing aging partisan veterans who might have met him. He found nothing. The ghost had done his job too well. He had disappeared so completely that even dedicated military historians couldn't track him. Volkov eventually gave up his search and wrote in his private journal, "Perhaps it's better this way. Legends should remain legends. If we found him, we'd discover he was just a man. And the world has enough men. It has too few legends." Jacob Hendricks died on March 3, 1984, at the age of 66. He was found in his workshop behind his house, a cluttered space filled with coils of wire, wooden pulleys, hand-drawn diagrams of mechanical systems, and tools so old they might have belonged to his grandfather. He died of a heart attack, sudden and complete, his body discovered by a neighbor who'd come to borrow a wrench. On the workbench in front of him was a half-finished wire trap designed to catch groundhogs that had been destroying his garden. The trap used a counterweight system and a tension release mechanism nearly identical to the designs he'd used to destroy German supply trains 40 years earlier. Same principles, different scale. The knowledge had never left him. His funeral was attended by 7 people. 3 co-workers from the railway, 2 neighbors, a distant cousin, and 1 man who traveled from Virginia and introduced himself only as a friend from the war. The stranger was an elderly Soviet emigre named Pyotr Volkov, the former partisan fighter who had watched Jacob's first demonstration in 1943, the man who had called him insane before watching him become a legend. Pyotr had spent 30 years searching for Jacob after immigrating to America in 1975. He'd finally located him 6 months before Jacob's death and had been quietly visiting once a month. 2 old men sharing tea and memories they couldn't discuss with anyone else. At the funeral, Pyotr was asked to say a few words. He stood at the graveside, looking at the simple headstone that read only Jacob Hendricks, 1918 to 1984, U.S. Army, and spoke in heavily accented English.
I knew this man in war. He was called useless. He was called fool. He was laughed at by soldiers who thought they knew everything about fighting. Pyotr paused, his eyes distant with memory. But Jakub understood something we did not. He understood that the old ways, the patient ways, the ways of watching and waiting and using the world itself as weapon, these ways are not obsolete. They are eternal. In Belarus, in winter of 1943, I watched Jacob Hendricks destroy German supply line using nothing but wire and patience. I watched him do impossible things, and I learned that in war, the most dangerous enemy is not the one with biggest gun, is the one who refuses to fight the way you expect. Jakub never wanted to be hero. He wanted to be invisible. He succeeded. Almost no one knows his name. Almost no one knows what he did. But I know. And I came here today to say the world was safer because Jakub Hendricks understood wire better than other men understood guns. He was not useless. He was essential, and we will not see his kind again. Pyotr placed a length of braided steel cable on Jakub's casket, a final tribute from one warrior to another, and walked away into the March rain. In 2007, 23 years after Jakub's death, the U.S. Department of Defense began declassifying World War II operational records related to partisan cooperation and special operations. Buried in 17 boxes of documents from OSS liaison operations in Eastern Europe, a researcher found a series of after-action reports from Soviet Partisan Command, translated into English in 1946 and immediately classified. The reports detailed railway sabotage operations conducted by an American advisor between November 1943 and May 1944. The operations were listed by code name: Minsk Ghost, Orsha Cascade, Warsaw Strangler, and credited with destroying or disabling 23 German supply trains, causing over 3,000 tons of material losses, and forcing Wehrmacht to redirect substantial combat resources to railway security. The American advisor's name was listed as Corporal Jacob Hendricks, U.S. Army, Detached Service with Soviet Partisan Forces. The file included technical assessments of his methods, diagrams of his trap designs, and testimony from partisan commanders describing his capabilities. One assessment, written by a Soviet military engineer in 1945, read, "Corporal Hendricks's techniques represent a fusion of pre-industrial trapping methods with modern understanding of railway mechanics. His innovations cannot be classified as conventional sabotage because they leave no explosive residue, no cut rails, no obvious evidence of human interference." German engineering battalions repeatedly classified his operations as equipment failures or structural collapses because the alternative, that one man with cable could systematically destroy their logistics network, was too improbable to accept. The file included a final note, added in 1946 by an American intelligence officer. Subject Hendricks has been debriefed and returned to civilian life. He has demonstrated no interest in further military service or consultation. His techniques are considered too specialized and too dependent on individual skill to integrate into standard doctrine. File closed. Recommend no further contact. When the documents were declassified in 2007, a military historian named Dr. Sarah Chen began researching Jacob's life, hoping to write a comprehensive history of his operations. She found his death certificate. She found his railway employment records. She found his discharge papers. She found testimony from 3 surviving partisan veterans who remembered him. But she found no photographs, no letters, no personal accounts, no family members who could provide insights into his personality or motivations. Jakob Hendricks had erased himself as completely as he had erased German supply lines. Dr. Chen published a paper in the Journal of Military History in 2009 titled "The Ghost of the Eastern Front: Asymmetric Railway Sabotage in WW2." It was read by approximately 400 people, cited by 12 subsequent papers, and generally ignored by mainstream military historians who found the subject too narrow and the evidence too incomplete. Jakob remained what he had always wanted to be: invisible. The story of Jakob Hendricks should have ended with his quiet death in a West Virginia workshop in 1984, but stories like his don't end, they transform. Today, in classified facilities where special operations forces train for asymmetric warfare,
instructors occasionally reference historical examples of individual operators achieving strategic effects through unconventional means. They don't usually name Jakob. Most instructors don't know his name, but they describe his operations as case studies in patience, observation, and using enemy infrastructure as a weapon. In engineering schools that specialize in infrastructure security, graduate students studying railway protection systems encounter academic papers analyzing the Eastern Front sabotage incidents of 1943 to 1944 as examples of attacks that exploited fundamental mechanical principles rather than security vulnerabilities. In Quantico, at the FBI Academy, trainers teaching infrastructure protection courses use sanitized versions of Jakob's operations to illustrate the difference between conventional sabotage and what they call physics-based exploitation, attacks that don't require breaking security protocols because they exploit the inherent vulnerabilities in how physics works. And in a small museum in Minsk, Belarus, there is a display about partisan operations during World War II. Among the photographs of partisan fighters and German supply trains burning in the snow, there is a small placard that reads, "Unknown American advisor conducted highly effective railway sabotage operations using improvised techniques, 1943-1944. Identity remains classified." Visitors walk past it without stopping. It's not dramatic enough to hold attention. There are no photographs of explosions being.
No stories of heroic last stands, no dramatic quotes, just a simple acknowledgement that someone was there, someone did something impossible, and then someone disappeared, exactly as Jakob would have wanted. At 11:47 p.m. on March 3, 1984, in a workshop in West Virginia, an old man's heart stopped beating. His hands, calloused from 60 years of working with wire and wood, relaxed on a workbench covered with tools that hadn't changed design since the 1700s. His eyes, which had watched German supply trains fall into ravines, closed for the final time. And somewhere, in a classified file in a government archive, a page documenting the impossible operations of Corporal Jakob Hendricks remained sealed, unread, gathering dust alongside thousands of other stories about men and women who changed history without ever appearing in it. The world called him useless. History proved them wrong. But history, like Jakob himself, knows how to keep secrets. The trap he built wasn't just made of wire and cable. It was made of patience, observation, and a fundamental understanding that the deadliest weapons aren't the ones that make the loudest noise. They're the ones nobody sees until it's too late. Jakob Hendricks understood this truth better than any soldier of his generation. He lived it, he proved it, and he took it to his grave without ever claiming credit or seeking recognition. He was the ghost who haunted German supply lines, the phantom who turned railways into death traps, the legend who existed only in classified files and whispered stories among aging partisan veterans. And in workshops around the world, in garages and basements and sheds, there are still men and women who understand what Jacob understood. That the old ways, the patient ways, the ways of wires and wood and careful observation, are not obsolete. They're eternal. Because physics doesn't change. Gravity doesn't negotiate. Momentum doesn't forgive. And a man who understands these truths really understands them, the way Jacob's grandfather taught him in the Appalachian Mountain Sound 70 years ago. That man is more dangerous than an army. No one ever called him useless again. His weapon was ancient, but his legend is eternal.